please. Thank you very much for doing that. And thanks everyone for joining us today. Today's the kickoff of our American Rescue Plan Act strategy session. It's a 5-part series. Today's kind of orientation, where we're going to cover all parts of the 5-tiered strategy that we've developed. And then following today's session, which we'll get into, and which many of you probably already have seen on the registration page, we're going to dive into each of the tiers over the next few weeks and talk about not only the strategy, but also do some hands-on work diving into your data from a programmatic perspective and showing how this all comes together. So today, hopefully you have some takeaways on what the strategy is all about, and knowledge of how we're going to start using program data to accomplish or execute all of the strategies over the next few weeks. My name is Chris Fabian. I'm CEO of ResourceX. We have a lot of our teammates on the line. We have a number of current priority-based budgeting implementers on the line, which is great. And we also have a lot of organizations who we've either just met through the ICMA regional conferences, where we were just presenting on the beginnings of this plan or last week, I think that was. And then some new organizations who probably learned about this offering via ICMA as well. So welcome everybody. We hope to have, you do not need to have been a priority-based budgeting implementer to acknowledge some of the strategies we'll talk about today, but we will get into how program data will serve you very well for the consideration of your use of ARPA resources. Also funny, we'll use ARPA, some use ARP, some don't use any of the acronyms and just go for American Rescue Plan Act funding. So choose your favorite acronym and we'll go from there. And you will also receive the recording after the session. You see over on the left-hand side is an icon or a screen capture of our paper. We did publish a position paper on the use and strategy for ARPA resources, and we would encourage you to download that. That's exactly what we're going to be covering over the course of our webinar series. We also have a blog about it, but without further ado, we'll dive right in. So part of the reason why we wanted to create this position paper is because among our current clients, as well as other local governments who we're working with, we recognize that these resources coming in are an absolute blessing. Like, holy smokes, this is an incredible moment of time, especially right off the heels of 2020. This is an incredible time to be a local government leader and have these resources coming in. And yet at the exact same time, we also recognize completely that it's not entirely a cakewalk for how we're going to use these resources in the best way possible. Some of our own clients have elected officials who see the resources coming in and know we have citizens, residents in immediate need right now. So people need relief, and their priority is to take the resources and as quickly as possible deploy them to make sure that we are addressing the needs of people who are suffering at this very moment. And that's an appropriate use of these resources. There's no question about it. At the same time, polling maybe in the other direction is a mindset or a best practice that we need to be very mindful that these resources are one-time in nature. They are not ongoing replenishable resources. And so to start programs or to enhance programs that we provide with one-time money brings with it a forewarning that we're going to have to revisit the use of these funds and how those programs are provided by this time next year or the year after. So one-time money being used for ongoing needs can always be a challenge. We have businesses who are barely hanging in there, and they are going to need some resources right away. And we have calls for, why don't we just look at the programs that we cut last year during 2020 and use the ARPA resources to restore the budget for those programs? Isn't that the most wise use of these resources? And on and on. I just toggled through some of the rest of the reasons. Some of our organizations, as you see, have an adopted budget today that includes plans for upcoming layoffs. And so their tension is, shouldn't they just use the ARPA resources to prevent those layoffs? Is that the best and most wise choice of the use of these funds? We have other organizations who are saying, man, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity. We need to put these resources towards our biggest goals. And then the question is, at what cost? Neglecting all of these other uses of resources. And then finally, some organizations, not all, but some, used reserves last year to get through 2020. And so the tension they face is whether or not to use the ARPA resources to simply replenish those reserves that we had to burn through. So what's the right strategy there? We get it, recognizing all of these tensions, and this is probably not even a comprehensive list, there's probably more. We wanted to come up with a game plan for how to imagine the use of ARPA resources to address all of these types of needs in a practical way. And so our approach, what has emerged, is a 5-tier strategy that very much feels like a hierarchy, or a Maslow's hierarchy of some way, shape, or form, where we're starting with tier 1 and talking about how can we portion off at least some of the resources in the immediate term for programs and projects that will help our people who are suffering the most, and how do we prioritize that? The second tier then moves up the ladder and suggests that there are some of our organizations who need to be working on budget stabilization. We dipped into reserves last year. We need to build those back up. Well, how long should we be looking at? What about organizations who might have compromised on their debt service payments or other contracts and liabilities? So the tier 1 and tier 2 are truly about emergency needs where we need our resources to be deployed. And you see there's kind of a short-term arrow pointing upwards. We're recommending that tier 1 and tier 2 are probably where we need to focus our time right off the bat. But we don't want to only focus on tier 1 and tier 2. Moving up towards the longer term strategy, we want to make sure that we're, at least to the greatest extent possible, holding back some of our ARPA resources to be able to hit tier 3, tier 4, and tier 5. What tier 3 is all about, and we'll get into it in this call, is taking a look at any of our interim budget amendments. We mentioned we have some organizations who have adopted a budget that includes cuts that were envisioned before the federal resources were made available. So how do we go back and reconsider those cuts and question, maybe some of them were a good idea. Maybe some of the reductions that we had planned for in our current adopted budget, we might still want to go forward with, or can we reallocate resources from within? Maybe we preserve the position, but have a chance now to reallocate what they're doing. So we'll talk about prioritizing budget amendments to your current budget. And that's when we really start thinking about the long-term strategy. As we move into tier 4, the recognition is that you have resources coming in, hopefully, if you're on this call, and you are not alone. There are other entities potentially within your region who are also receiving resources. And how can you band together and get a multiplier effect of the resources you have to do some amazing work? Part of tier 4 as well is recognizing that there are some other entities in your region who are not receiving ARPA money, and what to do about those entities. Should you automatically be looking at backfilling funding for local nonprofits, and how to start thinking about that kind of those kind of strategies? Finally, tier 5, the whole hope is that there's still enough resources given this bounty that is coming to really devote to some of your biggest goals. We have clients who are really actively concerned about implementing a climate action plan, or they're working on their equity initiatives, or they have basic infrastructure needs and a backlog. How can we make sure that we have resources available, not only for tier 1, 2, 3, and 4, but for the big commitments to your priority areas of the future? And this is what our entire game plan is going to be about. So again, this is our what we call 5 for the future. It's our overall prioritized strategy for use of the funds. And after today's kickoff, we're going to go through each of these tiers in specific detail. This slide might look kind of busy, but I just wanted to orient you. Tier 1 is going to be April 27th. Tier 2 is going to be May 6th. Tier 3 is May 18th. Tier 4 is May 27th. And Tier 5 is June 2nd, where each of those sessions are going to be specifically about one of the strategies, and then some hands-on time to talk about use of data to execute on any of these tiered strategies. Before we get into Tier 1, the most important recommendation that we can possibly make, besides having a strategy for the deployment of these resources, is that we want you to have data to bring to the table. And we're going to talk about building that data, but it's program and service level data that is a prerequisite or an extremely helpful tool in your toolbox that will help make the rest of these strategies come to life. And when we talk about program and service level data, I'll walk us through here in just one moment what that really looks like. But most of our organizations have line item data right now, and that is it's good. You can act on any of the strategies in our 5-point plan with line item data, but it gets a lot better if we are able to bring programmatic data to the discussion. So we're going to talk about how to build that. But what I mean is creating a program inventory, which is just a list of the services that your departments provide, understanding how line items associate with the program inventory. So how much does it cost you? Where are your current resources going? If we're going to have a discussion about resources and resource allocation, it will behoove us to know what we currently do and where those resources are going. And that's all we're talking about with program inventory and the allocation of your line item data to those programs. We can learn, as we will go through each of these strategies, more about the programs we provide by way of metadata. We call it basic program attributes, but what do we know about our programs from a mandate perspective? What do we know about our programs from a type of population served or size of population served? What do we know about our programs from a demand perspective? These basic program attributes are just characteristics of providing programs that are going to be very helpful to know as you're starting to consider what programs do we provide that impact people who are in need in our community? What programs do we provide that serve local businesses? That's what we're talking about with basic program attributes. You have the ability to go further. This is the type of work that we do with client organizations, is to align or talk about programs and their relationship to your strategic plan or to the type of outcomes that matter most in your community, and also program changes or program trajectories, what we call a program's future direction. We probably won't get into all of these sections today, but I did want to cover the fact that with a program inventory and some basic information about the programs we provide, we move from simply having line item based business intelligence to program based business intelligence. And this is going to be extremely helpful for implementing tiers 1 through 5 in our 5 for the Future plan. If you are brand new to any of this information and what I'm talking about program inventories and costs of programs and their alignment with outcomes, one of our key resources just came out in the government finance review is all about priority-based budgeting. And one of our clients is featured the city of Duluth, Minnesota, which is a really great crash course, if you will, on each of the pieces that we're going to be talking about. So I recommend it for you. And Liz or Eric, if you get a chance to drop it into the chat, a link to that paper, that would be awesome. But it would give you a nice primer. I thought I could give you 3 minutes on a basic primer for what we mean by program inventory and what it looks like. And then we'll start talking about how to use this data as you implement the 5 for the Future strategy. So when we talk about program inventory, we're literally talking about the simplistic understanding of what your departments provide. What programs did they offer today? Thanks a lot, Liz, for posting that. And for your organizations, a typical or average program inventory, as you see here on the screen, might include things like, as detailed as cemetery management, or your support of boards and commissions in your meetings, community events that you support, capital budget development versus operating budget development. We're simply trying to get into a list of all the programs that your departments provide, and maybe you might have somewhere on the order of 200 programs or so. We have clients like Lawrence, Kansas. I believe Josh from Salem, Oregon on the line. I believe you have a public-facing site as well, where you can go to their websites and get a good look at what a great program inventory entails. Longmont, Colorado is another who comes to mind. But this is something that you're really going to want to have available. Secondly, we cannot recommend this enough, having an understanding of where your current resources go by way of programs and cost allocation is the second component of program data that we hope that you have to bring to the table. And what we're talking about visually is the breakout of your budget, not just line items, but how resources are currently being allocated. So this is, what all of you are most familiar with. You already have your departmental budgets, but when we're talking about program inventories and the cost of those programs, you can see here, by way of example, I'm drilling into a solid waste management department and looking at each and every program within, from curbside recycling to curbside organic to basic trash collection or curbside garbage collection program, and on and on. That's what we want to see from the standpoint of where do our current resources go. In our tools, this is work that we do for organizations. You can actually break it down and see the personnel who support that program or the non-personnel, and see how those costs were allocated from a planning or budgetary perspective, and also get a sense for revenue collection for those programs. But this is the basic data that we want you to have to bring to the table. If you don't have this data, it's not a problem. In our follow-up workshops, we're going to be talking about how do you build this data that we're going to use. But let's get into it. We'll jump into tier one, which is how to start to think about people who need immediate relief and carving out some of our resources for those programs that are going to need some money right away, and how to find out basically where to start. Just like many of you, we are actively watching how the various programs of the American Rescue Plan Act are unfolding. And what has been very interesting is seeing that there are different components of the plan overall, besides the $350 billion. And some of them, as you see right here, $21.6 billion to help low-income renters pay rent and utilities, $12 billion for food hardship, or $50 billion for small business support. These are different components of the American Rescue Plan Act, above and beyond the $350 billion of direct support. And our fundamental advice, as hard as it is to try not to be redundant with other buckets of money, other programs that are becoming available. When you consider the $350 billion in direct assistance, we want you to make sure that you're using that for the 5-tiered plan. And if you have other needs in your community, make sure that you're scouring the other components of the American Rescue Plan Act to do our best not to use money where there's already another program set up. We have followed Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. I know National League of Cities has a great report as well. In fact, the Treasury is also releasing new information, and FEMA is out there providing great information as well. So simple point, but trying not to overlap is probably one of our best ideas. From there, how do we start to look at identifying programs that serve people in need, that need resources right away? With your program data, if all you had in front of you was a list of the programs and some information on how the budget is allocated to those programs overall, one of our best ways is to conduct a program insight workshop. This is what we're recommending for you to do with your departments. And the whole idea is to have it focused on an objective. And our objective right now is who is the most vulnerable among the people in our community? What programs are we offering right now that serve our people in need? And how do we start to think about getting those on the table and the budget recommendation to change those programs or to provide them in a more substantial way? So you have your program inventory, you have your program cost data. You might even have some of your basic program attribute data on whether or not programs are mandated or not, and the type of program people who they serve. In a program insight workshop, we are talking about the future direction of a program that you provide, which programs need more resources, and also where you might be able to find opportunities for resource reallocation and revenue generation overall. Boise, Idaho is one of the organizations who did an early version of what we call an insight workshop. And as you see here on the screen, they came up with some metadata. They came up with a program tag, a way to select various programs and put them on the table for what they called vulnerable populations. And we're sharing Boise's because you can look right through their criteria, and they did a really fantastic job. They had one category around programs geared specifically to benefit vulnerable, disadvantaged, or at-risk members of our community. That was basic program attribute scoring of 4. They tagged programs with that information. They tagged other programs that are not geared specifically towards assisting vulnerable, disadvantaged, or at-risk portions, but have provisions available for these members. By way of example, scholarship programs. They had a structured categorization of the types of programs that they were looking for. And this is part of our advice to you, is doing the exact same thing. Over here on the right-hand side of the screen, these are among all of the departments they have and the programs they provide within them. You could toggle to look within police, for example, and see their mental health coordination, their victim witness coordinators and special victims unit. These are the types of programs that were tagged with programs geared specifically to benefit vulnerable, disadvantaged, or at-risk members of their community. We could dig into planning and development services and see everything from rental housing to home ownership loans, permanent housing, fair housing program, neighbors in needs, their homelessness prevention. These are programs that they offer, and the special insight that they're able to develop by tagging them as programs who serve vulnerable populations is giving Boise a head start to say, these are the programs we should start to look at right away. We already know what they are as we consider what programs need resources to help people in immediate need of relief. What happens, this is City and County of Denver, Colorado, is that you move away from just a very high level conversation around, hey, how could we use the ARPA resources and what are the hotspots in our community, to a very data-driven program analysis of who the programs are serving and where they might need resources right away. In Denver, pretrial services are on the table right now as another example, because during COVID, during 2020, this was a program that they had to make substantial reductions to, and now the caseloads are mounting and people are staying, they're not getting their cases processed fast enough, and people are spending the night in the detention center unnecessarily, which has equity issues. It's also adding to higher costs than what they need to be facing for the detention center. So this is a program that they wanted to have on the table as well for this discussion. Whole point being, for Tier 1, we're going to advocate for you to conduct specific program reviews via an insight workshop, tagging those programs that you and your departments will come to learn have a direct connection with your most vulnerable populations. With that group of programs, now we can entertain how much money do they need, and how are we going to ramp up the provision of some of those programs in order to help our most vulnerable. Our second tier is emergency budget stabilization, and this is our in the most urgent category as well. So we now have our list of programs serving the most vulnerable. We're now going to move towards, what about those reserves that we had to dip into last year, and how do we come up with a game plan to begin to replenish those reserves? One of our client organizations right now is City of Toledo, Ohio. who's working through Bloomberg's Budgeting for Equity program. They have just announced news, 188 million coming in from the stimulus funds, and we're looking at deploying those to large projects, and that's awesome. The parenthetical is, of course, after their reserve is replenished. So Toledo, like many organizations, had to dip into their reserves. They're looking at a very concerning structural budget deficit. And the question is, how do we begin to rebuild that? One piece of advice that we had, I'm not sure if Tim Gelston is on the call today. I know he was registered, but I don't see him, from FEMA. FEMA has announced on their website that some of the uses of CARES money from last year, from 2020, are still eligible for reimbursement. Meaning if your organization was worried, for example, about deploying CARES resources, or you weren't sure if some of your expenses were going to be covered by the CARES Act, and you avoided getting those stimulus monies or grant monies from last year, they're still on the table right now. If you can go backwards in time and propose and say, do we have a chance to be reimbursed for some of these expenses that we incurred? This is an awesome provision because it's like forgiveness. If you had to dip into reserves last year in order to fund certain programs, maybe you can get reimbursed for some of the uses of that you took into consideration. The second part of emergency budget stabilization is about what did you use those reserves to do? So many organizations, in order to avoid massive layoffs in 2020, you transferred reserves in order to cover operating. And if those are not covered by CARES money, the question in front of you is, what programs did you subsidize with your reserve dollars? And what is the game plan as you now move forward to make sure that those programs aren't reliant on those one-time reserves in 2021, in 2022, and onward? And is it possible to consider the use of ARPA resources to begin to wean yourselves off dependence on your reserves? So you, in this case, ARPA resources are a bridge to get those programs back on track, but also recognizing that the ARPA funds are one-time in nature. Maybe this is a way to preserve them for one more year, while you then prioritize your ongoing resources for those programs that you wish to continue on into the future. Third point we wanted to hit here in emergency budget stabilization is that you don't have to replenish all of your reserve in 1 year. Consider a multi-year approach to building back some of your emergency reserves in 2021, build back maybe the full reserve by 2022 or 2023. That is a totally prudent approach to building back your reserves to make sure that we're not vulnerable again for whatever the next emergency might be. So that's what Tier 2 is all about. And as we get into the in-depth workshops, we're going to talk about how do you identify what are the programs that you funded last year with reserves, and how to start to consider alleviating your dependence on one-time money to provide those programs by using ARPA resources for a bridge. And you would only want to do that for programs that are of a high priority overall in your community. And then for other programs, it might be time to really start to consider, well, maybe we don't have enough ongoing resources to fund them forevermore. But that's what we're going to want to talk about in Tier 2. As we get into the third tier, prioritizing amendments to your current budget, this is where we start to make a transition between short-term, urgent matters and planning for more long-term strategic uses of ARPA resources. And this is a pretty exciting topic area. We're working right now with the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and they're in this exact same situation. So they passed a 2021 budget. They had to, that had their best worst choices for where they were going to make cuts and spending reductions if the ARPA resources had not been approved. And so now the multi-million-dollar question on the table is, they have recommended cuts on the table. How can they reconsider those cuts? It's like a reverse budget development process in order to restore funding to some programs, and for other programs, consider maybe they should go forward with those reductions and reallocate the resources away from how they were used previously. So those are the questions on the table. Should we preserve all positions automatically and restore programs to full capacity? And how do we evaluate this? So in priority-based budgeting, in the identification of programs and the costing of programs, I had shown that there was a scoring element, an evaluation of programs relative to basic program attributes and relative to outcomes that you are trying to achieve. And the simplicity of our process is that programs that score highly, that have the greatest amount to do with results and outcomes you're trying to accomplish, are ranked the highest. They're most relevant to you. And we call them quartile 1 or quartile 2 versus quartile 3 and quartile 4. In the budget development process, I'm going to try to bring this to life a little bit. What departments typically go through as they are making a budget recommendation is taking their line items, making recommendations maybe for professional services or for workforce training here. You have line item centric budget recommendations. And while that's easy for departments to do, they can look at their line item budget data and make these recommendations. It's less clear, what are these professional services resources doing? What is the workforce training budget supposed to be used for? And with your priority-based budgeting data, the whole idea is we could drill into professional services and see all of the various programs that are highly aligned with their results. We just talked about our quartile 1 programs. And it gives us new perspective to say, well, part of our professional services budget development request is associated with a quartile 1 program that has a high degree of alignment with the results we're trying to achieve, versus maybe a different part of that budget request associated with a quartile 3 program or something that has less to do with the outcomes they wish to achieve. They would say, we're not sure that this is a part of the request that we want to approve. And this is how to look at it moving forward as you're making budget development recommendations. They're trying to do the exact same process now, looking at their approved cuts, looking backwards to evaluate, are these appropriate cuts or where should we restore funding? So here's something really awesome. This is a list of the sum of recommended personnel cuts now by quartile in Pittsburgh's data. And as they are considering where to restore budget, they want to look at those positions that were tied to programs that had a high degree of priority, quartile 1 or quartile 2, as opposed to positions that were tied to programs that had less to do with accomplishing results in quartile 3 and quartile 4. For their higher priority personnel allocations, these are the most practical to restore. But as you can see, they cut it virtually in half for what is automatically on the table for restoration. And as they look towards the bottom, they can say, well, it's not that we want to reduce the people. It's not that we want to actually let them go, but is there a potential that we could reallocate the positions so they're not just going back to what they were doing before, but we can reconsider the position itself and reallocate to some of our higher priority quartile 1 or quartile 2 needs? Is there a 1-year plan to offset some of these programs that are that people support in lower priority areas with program revenues? So take the ARPA money, allow the program to persist for 1 more year with a game plan to find a new way to offset those costs and make them cost neutral. That's a great strategy for these types of programs. Is there a way to partner? Another great strategy overall. But I think you see what we're doing here. We're isolating these proposed reductions, and we're saying, how can we now apply programmatic data to reconsider if we're just going to automatically reinstate the funding overall? This is a totally awesome strategy, and we would highly recommend it. This is what Tier 3 is going to be about: conducting interim budget development process to evaluate proposals to amend the budget, tying personnel and non-personnel requests to programs, and looking at where you might have already had cuts on the table to reconsider those. And for other programs, where might you make a mid-year budget amendment, just like you would in a traditional budget development process, to think about what programs you wish to grow overall. All right, now we're getting into some fun stuff. Tiers 1 through 3 get us to that transition zone between short-term and long-term thinking. Tier 4 is where we start to think through who are the other partners in our community? Are they receiving ARPA resources? Maybe they're not. And how do we partner knowing that these resources are made available not just to our organization? So let's start with the part of the discussion about entities who are not receiving ARPA funds. And we have another Pittsburgh story for this situation. So Pittsburgh's looking at their parking authority, the Pittsburgh Parking Authority, as you see here on the screen. And this entity is not receiving ARPA funds. As many of you probably experienced, parking entities overall, our parking business, many of ours took a big hit last year. The situation is no different in Pittsburgh. So from the city's perspective, they're looking at the authority and quite worried that the authority will not be able to exist. Their financial sustainability was hit so hard in 2020, they are worried about 2021 in the future, and they have no ARPA resources coming in. So the city of Pittsburgh is thinking maybe we can use some of our one-time money to keep the parking authority in business, because if the parking authority goes out of business, their worry is it will have to be absorbed by the city overall. Now, are they simply giving a handout to keep the parking authority in business? No, they're tying that investment towards strategic objectives that the city has that the parking authority can help them execute with the money that they're giving them. For example, in Pittsburgh, they are really excited about funding their climate action plan and having a positive impact on their sustainability goals. So they're trying to ensure that the one-time resources are going to be used to build out EV charging stations throughout the parking complexes. So it's a win-win. It's keeping the parking authority in business and also making sure that they are using resources to accomplish what the city had as its own goals overall. The main point here, how do you identify some of those entities in your community who are vulnerable, who might not be receiving ARPA resources, but who you need to stay in business? Otherwise, a situation like Pittsburgh parking might arise for you. And then how do you ensure that the resources you give them are in line with your results, the results that you wish to achieve? That's a great way to look at this partnership opportunity. As we look at the other side of the equation, I want to point you to it in our very definition of customer success. Many of you priority-based budgeting implementers know this already. Leveraging all of your community's resources, taking this regional perspective, is one of the 4 levels of mastery that we espouse to our organizations. We have to be able to look for partnerships as we mutually approach our goals. We use the blueprint, where as you look towards your new needs as a community, you are trying to identify those new programs or new projects that need funding. And in order to fund those, you can partner, you can band together with regional service providers, you can free up and reallocate your own resources to fund those new needs, or you can generate new revenue. There are 2 main partnership opportunities that come out of this discussion as you're looking at funding your new needs. One is insourcing. So how can you form a regional partnership where some of your other partners are giving you their money? Maybe they're giving you some of their ARPA resources. And how can we look at partnerships where you're considering actually getting out of a particular business, letting somebody else take it on if it allowed you to free up your own resources and fund your new needs for the future? I'm going to give you 3 quick examples of what this looks like, but it's really powerful. First is a super simple example of fleet consolidation. So here's the city of Englewood, Colorado. Eric Keck's on the line. He used to be city manager of Englewood, Colorado. And Englewood had fleet operations just like its neighbors, Sheridan and Cherry Hills Village. As Sheridan looked at its long-term fleet needs, they're realizing they don't have enough money to maintain a high-quality fleet. And Cherry Hills Village was in the same way. So Englewood offered to merge the fleet maintenance operation, where Sheridan is now a paying customer to Englewood, and so is Cherry Hills Village. And all of their service levels go up. Sure, it costs Englewood a little bit more to maintain that fleet, but they're bringing in more than enough revenue to offset those costs and actually make a profit. What does this have to do with ARPA resources? Our recommendation is to take advantage of using one-time money from the American Rescue Plan Act to fund these types of partnership solutions, because all it takes is the one-time money that you didn't have before to improve your infrastructure, improve your garage, your fleet maintenance facility, do the consulting study to figure out what the rates and fees and charges are going to look like, what vehicles you should maintain in that fleet, what vehicles you're going to sell and recoup some money by way of the sale of the fleet. This is a great opportunity to create long-term success by spending one-time money. And that's exactly how Inglewood went about it, not with ARPA resources, but with one-time money. Inglewood turned right around and had the exact same type of thinking as they looked at their fire department. And in this case, they weren't the insourcing partner, but they outsourced and merged fire departments with the city and county of Denver. So you can have it both ways. In this case, as you see through the slides, this is an old presentation that Eric made. Their fire equipment was outdated and in need of substantial investment to maintain. Their facilities were in disrepair, and the amount of money to maintain or bring them up to operational standards was insurmountable. Their ability to compensate staff was not where they wanted it to be. So think about it. If you're in this type of situation, don't use ARPA resources to try to just backfill and bring your fire department or any other department that meets this storyline up to where you want it to be, but use the one-time money to create a regional partnership, if that's possible, that is going to be win-win for you and your neighbors. And that's what Inglewood did with fire. Brad Steckert, who's on the line, comes from Washington County, Wisconsin, and they did the exact same type of approach, this time looking for regional partnerships of all variety, not just fleet or public safety. In their case, a highlight story was merging a health department. What Washington County did that was so profound was they launched an initiative called Counties Without Borders. And the whole point was Washington County has a program inventory, just like we've talked about, and they shared that program data with their neighbors in hopes of finding regional cooperation initiatives. They found numerous. I highlight their health department merger overall. What happened was the county in Washington County and their neighbor pulled their health departments together. They merged. Yes, they found that there were redundant positions, people who were doing the same thing in one county health department as another person in the other county's health department. Instead of laying off those people, they reallocated the positions to new job duties, just like we were talking about in the Pittsburgh case study example. And when you do that, you end up with new workforce, people providing services that neither entity was able to provide before without having to ask the taxpayers for any additional money. So service levels go up without asking for any additional money from the citizens overall. We thought this is a great story. Another example of using one-time money, in your case now, ARPA resources, to pursue partnerships that can create a long-term abundant source of efficiencies or higher service levels as you look out towards regional partners. And that is what Tier 4 is all about: leveraging program inventory data, reliance on your organization to provide a program, and overall prioritization, result alignment to identify regional partnerships. And we call it program mapping, but it's just looking for those types of partnerships that can exist. And that moves us to Tier 5. And our hope is you have focused on Tier 1 through 4, but we still have prioritized or held back some of our long-term, some of our resources for what we call big swings. And this comes from the city of Fort Collins, Colorado. This is their term. And their idea was investing resources to achieve results that are of substantial importance to your community, but also spending money to save money, very much in line with what we just talked about for taking advantage of your regional partners. The storyline that we want to point to for Tier 5 is the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. They have assembled their program inventory data, the program costs. They align programs with results. but they got into all of this work because they have a big swing. They want to substantially ramp up their investment in achieving their climate action plan. And they simply have not had the resources to prioritize this before. This is a part of their story, a screen capture. They were one of the cities chosen by Bloomberg Philanthropies in the Climate Challenge Cities program. They received resources to create climate action plan goals and an implementation plan. Their challenge was in 2020, when it came down to the budget, there's barely enough money to go around and preserve basic operations, let alone prioritize funding to afford a climate action plan. So they followed the blueprint, just like we talked through with the partnership example, to come up with programmatic opportunities for change, resource or revenue generating ideas. They have $18 million worth of ideas on the table to execute. That would give them 18 million in ongoing resources and 23 million from resource reallocation from program partnerships and sourcing, like we just discussed, and also program efficiencies and service level trade-offs, doing less of something in order to free up resources to do more of something else. So with their program inventory data, they now have $41 million worth of potential insights to take action on and afford that climate action plan. What's the point? What's the connection to the ARPA resources? Our point is, if you can focus the use of your one-time money to discover these programmatic opportunities, where to outsource and free up resources like Inglewood did with Fleet, where to find program efficiencies, where to find programs that you want to do less of because they don't align with the results that you're trying to accomplish. Use your one-time money to discover these opportunities and create long-term, ongoing sources of reallocated resources and new revenue, so that ARPA is not just a one-time thing, but it's actually spending money now to save more money for your future. Earlier this year, in our annual report, we published a list of cities and counties and their annual resource reallocation, as we could measure within the tools. Is money going from one program to another program? And as you can see, Shawnee, Kansas at 11% resource reallocation, or Kansas City, Kansas at 11%. If you compared the order of magnitude of this resource reallocation from a dollar standpoint and compared it to the amount of money that Shawnee or KCK or a number of these organizations are receiving from the American Rescue Plan Act, you'll discover that this 15 million is awfully close to what they're receiving in American Rescue Plan Act money. It's less, but not by much. KCK is the same way. They can demonstrate $76 million in resource reallocation, and the American Rescue Plan Act money is just above 76 million. Our point is, don't settle for getting American Rescue Plan Act money as a one-time investment that you use to support programs directly or projects alone. Use it to study reallocation opportunities and program revenue generating opportunities, so you end up with ARPA every year, a one-time investment of funds to create that type of resource abundance in an ongoing fashion forevermore. That is where we really encourage you to go. And that is what Tier 5 is all about, is conducting a future-focused program insight workshop at both the program and project level to identify bold investments and also applying the blueprint to achieve a sustainable, recurring source of ongoing resources via resource reallocation. This rounds out the high-level overview of each of the 5 concepts. We recognize completely that for some communities, you might not need, for example, emergency budget stabilization. We have a couple of clients who luckily did not have to dip into reserves last year. That's great. If you don't have a Tier 1 or a Tier 2, that means all the more resources to use for Tier 3, Tier 4, or Tier 5. But what we will go through over the next few weeks, it starts with Tier 1, how to get a program inventory together if you don't have one already, and how to start to identify, just like Boise did, what are the programs that currently serve people who are your most vulnerable in your community, and how do we focus on those programs and get kind of down to the detail of what are the most eligible things for you to be investing your resources in to help people in need. The next week, we'll go into tier 2 and really focus on budget stabilization, reserve replenishment, studying programs that were sustained last year by one-time reserve transfers and what to do about those programs, how to prioritize the use of those resources. And we'll move through each of the tiers over the course of the next few weeks. My final point, and I'd be happy to take questions if there are any, is even if you don't have program data today, and I know we have a mix of organizations who do have program data and some who don't, that will be a part of the workshop training as well over the next few weeks, is how to get that program data. You can build it very quickly and have it to be able to use to implement and execute all of the 5 tiers. And that's what we really hope that you do. So I know that was a little bit of a fire hose. There's still 5 minutes left. And I'm really happy that most everybody has stuck around till the end here. I'm happy to take some questions. You can feel free to type in the chat or come off of mute if you would like to. And I'll pause for a second and just see if there are any questions at the moment. Ooh, they give me a chance to take a drink of water too. We just presented this last week at one of the ICMA regional conference events that they're hosting. We'll continue to post on ICMA's channel as each of the sessions becomes available. I think by way of your registering for this presentation today, you automatically are registered for the upcoming webinar training series. But feel free to come onto our site where we are posting the white paper and the blog on the 5-tier strategy. And again, we just hope that you'll stay on board as we work our way up through the plan. Great. Well, thanks everybody. It's a great way to kick off Monday. It's talking about resource abundance. Thanks, Jan. Cool. Thanks, everyone.